Okay, welcome back everybody. It's good to have you here on this rainy, overcast, beautiful day.
We'll take it while we can get it.
We will take it, absolutely, while we can get it. Okay, so we're going to get stuck straight into it because you're going to be doing a fair bit of doing today. A bit of cognitive demand coming up because you're going to be marking some sample student work. We'll have a taste of it if you haven't tasted it already. Now, the pre-workshop activity I'd like to do, hopefully some of you have done it. These are basically our learning goals. Who has created a group for their assignment? Okay, so maybe 10%. This is what we're going to be doing, so keep in mind that you need to form groups, you need to be proactive about that, be organised. It's the best way to avoid grief and pain and misery and coming to the unit coordinator with a sad story, if you can avoid it. We did have a pre-workshop activity. Attributes of quality assessment we're going to be talking about today because that forms a critical part of everything that we do. If we're not providing quality assessment, why not? But we're going to have a more focused application on reliability. We're going to revisit the ISMG principles again. And I'm going to do that regularly with you. I believe in repetition and drip, 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 drip. Like imagine a big dam, and when you're exposed to new concepts, it's a bit like drip feeding rather than a whole avalanche of water coming at you in one foul swoop. So we're going to mark a student response, annotate and discuss, mark another student response, annotate and discuss. And if you have time, anyone who wants to write a student response for the group to mark. Obviously we're not aiming for a high level, we're just wanting mid-level. Not necessarily high level, but if you write a high level, then it's a high level, but we're not expecting a high level. And we're going to practice feedback. So, by the end of this tutorial, you'll need to organise your groups. All tutorials are important, but especially 4 and 5, because we're going to be actually modelling internal moderation processes, which is actually one of the criticisms that was brandied about when I was a teacher in school. We'd get these students coming to us and they wouldn't know how to mark and they wouldn't know how to internally moderate, and there are parts of their skill set that were missing, and it wasn't their fault. The blame was being firmly directed at the tertiary system. That, as you can see, has changed, which is why we're doing it here. When I went through my degree, we didn't even talk about marking student work, it didn't even come up, which is quite interesting. And that's just another indication of how society evolves. You know, those values and attitudes and beliefs we talk about in our syllabus affect every part of society. So this is what our pre-workshop learning was. It was literally clicking on that link and reading about the 3 and then representing that into another form. And representing is a really wonderful strategy for differentiating for your students. So for example, all it means is if you give students a novel, that might be a lot for students to cope with. At certain points, you might break a chapter down. You might say to a student, okay, to your class, here's a chapter of the novel, read that, and then represent it into a different form. The student might say, well, I'm a really good drawer. Great. Tell me what that chapter's about using a drawing. Another student might say, I'm great at writing poetry. Great. All right. Take that chapter, represent it in another form, poetry, or music. Or use an image to reflect what that chapter is about. It's called representing, and it's one of Walke's differentiation strategies, which is why I used it here. I was giving you a chunk of information to use, to read, and I was asking you to represent it in another form. Did anyone do it by any chance? Great. Do you want to,
It was a very considered and lengthy process.
Yes.
I did. There's that little diagram picture.
Okay.
The camera's away.
Thank you. Stay on top of me because I've been working like 14-hour days plus preparing for this as well. So yeah. Say, excuse me. So sorry, can you just, okay, so that's, yeah, there we go. That's what you've got. And can you explain that now? Can you show it to everybody?
That is my very artistic version of a set of scales.
Oh, and what is a set of scales representing for you?
Balance and weighing of multiple factors, and I have them in line so that one side is not outweighing another, so that you're looking at all the considerations of assessment and meeting all the needs of all the different parties.
Wow, so you've given us a sketch that reflects all three working together. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Reliability, accessibility, and validity all work together. Correct. Perfect balance. Yes. Scales. I like it. That's also a metaphor. And I get excited about metaphors. So that's actually a really nice way to look at those attributes of quality assessment. Set of scales. If we have all of those being attended to in a school, then we're going to have balance. When we have balance, we have a solid assessment program. Okay. But before we go any further, what I want you to do now is I want you to, in your mind, write down the things that you expect to see in quality assessment. Every time you're assessed at QUT, when you go into the classroom and you put an assessment instrument in front of students, what do you think should be in that or on that task sheet? Go, 5 minutes. Have a think about it. Brainstorm. I'm asking you what quality assessment looks like to you. What are its properties? Oh, there's the roll here too. Has anyone not? Thank you. Maybe you're not sure, and that's okay too, but what are your expectations? As many as you can think of. If I was in a high school classroom, I'd be doing this on a tablet, or I'd be doing it on Infodo. Just saying, collate those ideas over. Anyone need more time? You all good? All right. So take a few moments to discuss with your next door neighbours what you had and whether you agree, disagree or want to add. In other words, try and create the most comprehensive list you can at your tables.
Like every kid working place. Not me.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah. That's what I like quality assessment. Like every student in the classroom that we have to
So like
even like neighborhoods that have
see, I always thought
that's not a thing, is it?
So you have a strong commitment to equity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of actually assessing.
I feel like it's an interest.
Yeah. A strong sense of justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be quality, it has to have like
Yeah. Alright, well, so, was it equity, reliability?
I love the close up.
What was it? Equity, reliability, and what was the third one?
Evidence-based,
Validity.
informative.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to cheat. You're supposed to come at it from what you value, what you perceive. Are you reading off something? Oh, excellent! Great.
What is reading?
Bye.
Come on, guys.
Like, where's the answers though? Like,
Oh well. That's all right. How did you represent it then? Did you draw a poem or? Let's have a look. Oh, you took notes.
yeah.
Oh wow, you're very studious, aren't you? But what you did, and that is
Wish my hair was out.
what you did was you annotated. We're going to call those annotations. You took the key parts of the text that made sense to you to help you unpack it and understand it.
Beautiful.
And that's what we're going with. That's good.
There you go.
Okay.
We got a good list?
I think so.
Ready to share?
Share away.
All right. Well, just let me bring back to the group.
Because I only like to do it probably with minor revisions, say once every 5 years. So there's the whole heap.
Okay. So let's come together as a group now. Let's go from table to table. Away you go.
So we were looking at more the equity side of things, making sure like the assessment is that all students can complete. Doesn't matter if they have like an intellectual, all that kind of stuff. Like every student's different, but they should all be able to complete this one assessment, and that the content of the assessment should have related back to the lessons that they did. If that makes sense. So
Yes.
if they were doing a short story for their assignment, but they did reports all semester, like that wouldn't make sense.
So you're talking about backward mapping, which we've talked about here, and alignment, which is, oh yes, right up there. Both of those things. We'll talk about how you achieve those. Yep. And yep, away you go.
We spoke about that it needs to connect to what was taught in class, so that goes into aligning with the curriculum. Be evidence-based, informative, so to help tutors and teachers teach it better, maybe next time. Have a real-world context attached, especially in a school setting, and accessible for every student. Yeah.
So you've actually hit on another few very important things, especially in the English discipline, in terms of that use of the word authentic and context, which is surprisingly not always easy to do in our discipline. A lot of teachers really struggle with ways of doing that, in other words, to create a realistic context, because we know all our students have an audience of the teacher, don't we? Realistically, if it's a speech, then it's the peers. How do you create a really authentic task that enables them to demonstrate roles and relationships with the audience if you don't create something outside that? And it's something I have a lot of conversations with people about. And actually, interestingly, you can't endorse the assessment instrument if it doesn't have an authentic context. Okay, a table here. What do you reckon? What do you want to add?
We've said a lot of what everyone else has said. Clear assessment criteria. It covers what has been taught in the unit. There's feedback involved.
So drafting.
There's a moderation process at the end as well, at all stages.
What's really interesting is that all three groups have talked about alignment between teaching and learning and assessment. So I think that's you coming at it as both a student and a teacher, because there's nothing worse, nothing more frustrating than being assessed on something you haven't actually been taught about. And we've all experienced that over the, different times, different lives. Okay, our table here.
Again, it's aligned with the assessment must cover what's being taught.
Yep.
It has to allow for a fair comparison of the students working against the syllabus, not just what's been presented, so there should be some extension in that, ability to think creatively.
Yep.
And it has to allow the students the ability to sort of individualise their response to maximise, I suppose, their particular idiosyncrasies and skill and ability.
That is really interesting. So we've had some other additions over here about students being able to produce their own unique individual responses. Now that's really important, and once again we can't endorse an assessment instrument if it does not allow students to do that. So how do you as English teachers write assessment that allows students to do that? Yep.
Give them options. If you want them to analyse two texts in a certain way, give them different stimulus that they can look at them from.
And what, yes?
So if you were looking at dystopian texts, then you can look at different themes that run through that, and they can look at those concepts further in depth so that you don't get 30 of the same talking about totalitarianism. They might be talking about another concept that can be seen.
Okay, so you're talking about having options on the task sheet? Yes. What about the question itself though? What about the way you've formatted the task in scaffolding?
In that you can agree or disagree with the question.
Yes. So some teachers unwittingly and with the best of intentions will accidentally give students the thesis statement. Even if it's only implicit. They'll say things like, in your persuasive speech, persuade the audience that climate change needs to be addressed. Well, that means the student can't argue the opposite point of view, and they're doing it with the best of intentions. They're trying to actually give students some focus because some students don't cope with a lot of options. But in the process, they're going to get 30 responses all arguing that, even if they don't actually happen to believe that. But that might be the teacher's belief and value system, but it may not necessarily be the student's. The other thing that schools do in their assessment instruments to prevent this idea of providing a unique response is that they provide so much scaffolding in the task that they tell students what to put where. And one of our objectives, which you're becoming familiar with, assesses students' ability to sequence their ideas. And if teachers are telling students where to sequence their arguments, so for example, some might put in their task sheet, argument 1 is big businesses are the problem when it comes to climate change. Argument 2 is the government needs to do something. Argument 3, and so on. You can see how the teachers actually stepped them through the sequencing and provided them with too much support, so that again you're going to get the same responses through. The biggest travesty about that is that students aren't being allowed to bring what they believe to the table. And you want them to bring their own arguments, not use someone else's arguments. Yep.
What about in terms of like differentiation, if some students need a bit more scaffolding than others?
Do it outside the task sheet.
Okay, all right. So like same task sheet for everyone, and then outside the task sheet you can give them like extra scaffolding, like grass tables.
Because the QCE certificate is the same for every student in Queensland. So you can never change the objectives in a syllabus. It's your level of support that you provide. The moment, though, that a school starts providing too much support to a student, it becomes a question of ethics then, and whether the work is the students or not, and that's another conversation.
Yeah, and
but
it's an equity issue as well.
Yeah. So, okay, we touched on quite a few things there. When you go into the schools, it's a good opportunity to go into the school portal, the QCAA portal, and have a look at these documents called the Quality Assurance Tools. Now, I work with these documents all the time, and they're pretty chunky looking documents, and they're not pretty, but they talk about alignment with the syllabus. I heard the word curriculum. You must assess the syllabus, what the syllabus requires you to. So it has to align with the subject matter, the objectives and the specifications of the syllabus. It has to be authentic, which is the context that we talked about. There has to be the opportunity for students to provide their own unique response. The task must allow students to respond in using the right technique. So for English, it's the extended response technique because they're long responses. That's what we call the item construct. And you must, I can't show you the document because it's in the portal, it's locked away, I'm just remembering what's in it. We talked about context. That's all to do with validity. We're going to talk about validity in a minute. We're going to come back to your point now, accessibility. So you're talking about equity and everybody being able to access the task. Well, part of that is about the language you use and your language choices. So what I mean by that is that nothing on that task sheet can alienate another student group, culture, religion, so on. Because we know that the language we use has a lot of connotations to it and it can prevent some students from accessing that task. So it needs to be neutral language, no value judgments associated with that. It also means that the language choices need to be suitable for Year 11 students and Year 12 students. So free of jargon and ridiculously high convoluting language. It also needs to be laid out properly. So when you talk about the format, easily accessible. It is extraordinary how many assessment instruments have bullet points misaligned and paragraphs smooshed, very sophisticated term, smooshed together. So all those things. So we just talked about validity and accessibility. So validity is all about satisfying the syllabus objectives and the syllabus. Accessibility is making sure there's nothing, no wording in that task that prevents or excludes another culture from accessing it, or that it's not so precise that students can't. If anyone needs any examples of that, you let me know. I'll do that. So this is validity. This is what you'll find when you click on that link. That's the big one. We got that one. Yes. Content validity. You said it. Test what they claim to measure. Yes, we got that, gentlemen. Sorry, what's your name?
Roger.
Thank you, Roger. Testing what they claim to measure. Reflecting curriculum requirements, we had that. Are authentic, we had that. And appropriately challenging, someone did make that comment, that it's got to be designed in such a way that the discerning kids, remember that qualifies in our syllabus, the high level kids can do it to that level, but that the lower level kids can also experience success. And that's why in our ISMGs you have discerning at the top and you have insufficient or narrow right down the bottom. Are authentic and appropriately challenging, provide realistic contexts. Yes, we see some really wonderful ones, like for example, students presenting a persuasive speech to the local city council about a community event or function or issue that is really meaningful and relevant. Allow students to demonstrate specified performance level within curriculum documents. We're going to be talking about performance levels a lot today. So that's what validity means. I'm going to show you an assessment instrument at the moment. You're going to tell me if it's valid based on your knowledge of the syllabus. And this is accessibility. And none of this is rocket science, but we've just put labels on it now, coming into the new system. We're really digging down into it and making it very point outable and in black and white. So, how to demonstrate their learning, that's all what it's about. Sharing assessment information before the assessment is administered. We haven't talked about that, but in the syllabus it says 3 weeks notice of task, 4 weeks notice of task. And this causes a little bit of uncertainty sometimes. But what this is saying is that even though the syllabus says you don't physically give it to students until 3 weeks outside the due date, if it's 3 weeks notification, you're still talking about it all the way up to that point in time. So the assessment instrument that students get should never be a surprise or a shock. Providing all students with sufficient exposure to and practice in the work prior to the assessment. That can actually be difficult if you work in a school where there's high absenteeism. So you have to be creative about the way that you engage in teaching and learning. Providing feedback that is timely enough to enable students to apply it. Parents get really cranky when their children are being asked to provide a draft and the due date is 2 weeks away or a week and a half away, and the child gets the feedback on the draft the day before the final is due or 2 days before. That might be something you want to talk about in your assignment, perhaps. You don't have to, there are lots of things you can talk about. So, I was talking to a teacher the other day, and their school policy is that they turn their draft over before the next lesson. That's phenomenal. That means if they get the assessment instrument on the Thursday and the next lesson is on the Friday, they're turning them over. It's really good if it happens to fall on a Friday, at least they've got the weekend, whichever way you look at it, to get it back to students on the Monday. So you can just see.
I don't want to work there.
I'm not allowed to say which school that is. But schools, again, there's so much variety. But what that's doing is it's creating an equal platform for all students. It's an equalising of their experiences. So I've actually
one class has the next. So if all of grade 11 is due on Wednesday,
Yep.
11A then has a class on Thursday, but 11B doesn't have a class till next Monday.
That's the way it is.
Okay.
They might rotate that, so there's equity by the end of the year in terms of sharing that out. I was going to say there was, I've lost it now. There's something about. I was going to share a story. Maybe it'll come to me. This is really important. Take into consideration issues of access, equity, and diversity. An example that always comes to my mind is if you said on a task sheet, explain the representation of skegs in Lockie Leonard, then straight away you eliminate a large number of students in your class. Anyone who doesn't know what a skeg is, because that's colloquial language. Oh, it's a surfing. It's an old-fashioned term, because my husband used to be a surfer.
Okay.
Still kind of is, but not really. But they used to call them skegs. People just, all they thought about was surfing. So you can see how your language can alienate very quickly, even without you realising it. Effectively communicating to students what is required for successful completion. This is incredibly difficult. The number of tasks we see coming through where they contradict each other. For example, a school might ask a student to explain the representation of gender in XYZ, and then later on down in the next paragraph it will say, explain the representations of blah blah blah. And what's happened is the student's been given a command to think of a representation singular, and then it's gone to plural, which is really significant in terms of scope and scale of a task. And it's often not deliberate. So sometimes I'll say in the first part the representation of Australia and Australian identity, and then throughout the rest of the task I'll only refer to identity. Or in one part of the task I'll talk about students have to creating the genre of a film review. But further down they might not call it a film review, they might call it a PowerPoint, a multimodal PowerPoint. So it's about consistency. So clear instructions is really important. Clear assessment criteria, that is taken away from students, from schools, because we've got the ISMGs now. Just on that, what do you reckon one of the first learning experiences would be for your students? Now I'm pointing to criteria. What do you think would be one of the most valuable things you can do, regardless of your subject area, in year 11 when your students enter the room at the start of that year? Yep.
Explain the ISMGs and how they work.
Yeah.
Show them what the cognitions are so they know what they have to do to get discerning.
And do you know that in all my time in teaching, I don't think we ever did that. Ever. But if you at the start of year 11, you have a learning experience for each objective, your students are going to have a really clear idea of what it is they're being required to produce, and as a result of that, be more likely to be able to do it.
Yeah, at my SRI school at the moment, in our year 12 music class, first lesson that I was in, the teacher was saying, alright, so this is what your assessment is, this is the ISMG, and she had it up on the board, and she was like, alright, we're going to break down the ISMG, this is what this word means, I need you to be doing this.
Yeah.
So they were typing out the specific things that she wanted from them from the ISMG. So I think that would be really helpful if we had something like that, but unfortunately we didn't. Well, I didn't.
Yeah.
We'll keep my criteria sheet until I started the masters.
Yeah.
Criteria before, how am I so dumb?
See, it's just so interesting, the things we don't always think about.
Yeah.
And it's not deliberate, it's just that we don't know what we don't know. And whilst the syllabus says 3 weeks notice of task, you can still unpack all the objectives and say, this is what this means. When I say representation, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Try and explain the concept of representation to students. Have a think about that, how you're going to actually make that abstract idea, that concept, a very real thing that they can work with in every text that they work with in English, which is the challenge and joy of our subject. Inclusive strategies to adjust teaching and learning experiences and assessment to enable all students. So this comes back to your equity idea, and we call that ARA in the new system, and there's a QCE handbook. It's a really long title to document, but it talks about how assessment can be altered to cater for certain students, but there's a process that sits in that. And of course all that, designing assessment with clear and specified conditions. Again, these conditions are provided in the syllabus now. So 500 to 800 words, for example, 5 to 8 minutes, they are conditions given to us. So we don't really need to worry about that so much now. So that's accessibility. Validity, the construct, the syllabus, and this is making sure the task that a parent can pick it up potentially and understand, hopefully understand, and that the students can understand. So I think we did pretty well. I think between all of us, we got pretty much all of that, which is a good sign. It means we've got a fairly good understanding of assessment. Those quality assurance tools, if you can get your hands on them when you get to school, ask for these quality assurance tools because it's a document that each teacher literally ticks boxes once they've constructed an assessment instrument to make sure that absolutely everything that they can possibly do or think about has been checked. Now we get to reliability. Now this is the focus of our shoot today. What is it? What it means is that the teacher marking in Cairns gets the same mark as the teacher marking in Brisbane to the same mark that the teacher in Longreach. That's a big deal in a subject like English, where there are extended responses. You've got a lot of information to wade through. And we know for a fact that the longer the response, extended responses are notorious for having a little bit more subjectivity in them than the black and white math science where there's a right and a wrong answer. Because there has to be, because there's lots of ideas in there and they're all melded together. You look at our objectives, they're even interlinked, and there's some overlapping there. But we can do it. But it comes down to a few principles. So it's about accuracy and precision of our marking. And that's I think why some people get really worried about confirmation. They worry that the mark they put on that student work is not going to be agreed with by the confirmers. You know, those faceless, nameless people sitting behind their computers at QCAA somewhere. And that's a very real thing. And we are acutely aware of it. But we're also aware of the fact that the teacher has interrogated it, that school has their own internal moderation process, and that's what you guys are actually demonstrating. That you understand how a quality assurance process works. We call it internal moderation. All schools have different approaches and ways of doing it, but we know they have that now. If they didn't have it in the old system, they now have it because they know their work is going to be going somewhere else, and 2 or 3 people are going to cast their eyes over it and to see. But we do know that schools do a good job. We do know that teachers know what they're doing. We do know that teachers have interrogated that, and there is faith in that. That is given credit. So, it's not a process really to be nervous about. If the marking is not confirmed, then it's a conversation. So marking guides helps us award marks that are comparable to those awarded by another marker, and we went through some of those rules last week. I'm going to go through those rules again. We're getting a lot of questions about those at the moment in terms of possible scenarios and how they all work. Reliable assessment ensures that judgments are trusted and defensible, and I reckon I know that when I started teaching, that was one of the hardest parts of my job, is having faith in what I was putting down on that document. But if you follow the process that we use today, you can stand there with your hand on your heart and say, I matched it to that because of this. And when I say this, you're pointing to the evidence in the student work. You're not just plucking stuff out of the air. There's a reason you put that mark there, and you can explain it. Teachers can achieve reliability in the classroom by engaging in conversations to interrogate the standards and descriptions prior to teaching. So we have this really, really wonderful phrase called shared understanding. And research shows that the best professional development you can get is to sit around and talk about stuff. Which is why in these tutorials I give you opportunities to talk. I know not everyone likes group work. I know that not everyone feels like engaging in conversation, because it does take a bit of energy, and you'll have moments where you just want to receive rather than give, and that's okay too. But to develop this shared understanding means that you need to talk about it. And there are a lot of really rigorous conversations where teachers disagree with particular marks that have been awarded to student responses, and not to be afraid of that, but to just say, why do you say that? What are you seeing? Where's the evidence in the student work? And let the person talk. And then you can say, but actually, I see this, and this. And then you go, okay, well, you see that, I see that. Let's reach a shared understanding. What is there more of? And you talk it through. And you can come across some really unique situations and unique student responses that you might sit there and go, I just don't know what to do with this. But that's okay. You go to your head of department, you go to a trusted colleague, you sit down with 3 people. Today, I had a phone call from someone, and it was a really interesting and difficult question that took 4 of us to actually talk it through. And that's what we're talking about, that community of practice idea. So, providing as much appropriate detail as possible about the assessment to guide students. So this is coming back to your feedback to students. Every time you put a tick on an ISMG, you're telling the student they are effective, they are discerning, they are appropriate, or they're showing insufficient or inadequate or narrow or uneven. You're telling them that. Which is why it's important to explain to students how it actually all works, because then when you put a tick somewhere, it means something to them. And comments, in terms of comments. Your feedback to your students is critical and is also a skill. I'm going to talk about that today as well. So providing students opportunities to engage, well, we said that. Engaging in professional moderation conversations with colleagues to share samples of students' work and to check marking consistency. That's why we're doing what we're doing for your assessment instrument. So ideally, when you go into a school, or when you start working at a school full time,